So I want to take a few minutes this morning to talk to you about why Verizon has chosen NG-PON2 for its Intelligent Edge network. We'll start off just talking about what our Intelligent Edge network, or IEN, is, and then take a look at some of the distinctives of NG-PON2 that make it the right fit for that network. And then at the end, I want to take a look at three different technology areas within the NG-PON2 scope that we're really trying to push vendors to make a lot of progress on, because we think that they are really critical for the NG-PON2 ecosystem. So to start out with, this is what the Intelligent Edge network looks like from just a conceptual point of view. And the big deal here is that Verizon needed a single network from the core all the way out to the customer for both the wireless and the wireline. You would understand that typically, as the wireline and wireless companies came together, the networks didn't come together, and that was certainly the case for us, at least not completely. So we're pushing for a single shared network here, and you'll notice that as you look at, as you look at the left-hand side of the diagram, you can see that we're trying to provide service for both the residential, for small business, medium business, for enterprise, and for things like distribution to cell service. And while you'll see that in some cases there is direct transport into the enterprise segment and some special transport into the cell segment, in the access portion of the network, we really want to be able to provide transport to all of these segments of our customer groups. So how do we do that with NG-PON2? Well, let's take a look at it. Just in general, this block would be the NG-PON2 OLT. The first thing to mention is that you get a 10 gigabit per second channel bandwidth. That's line rate. Actually, it's going to be more like about 8.5 gigabits per second by the time you strip off the overhead and get to the usable user bandwidth. The next thing to note is that it uses the same sort of power split system as GPON does. And as a matter of fact, what I'm showing here is that we're overlaying the NG-PON2 network onto an existing GPON network, but you could also come and go directly to the power splitter. And then the last thing to note is that just like GPON, you can serve a variety of customers off of that power split. So looking at some of the advantages, and I'll tell you right away, there's an error on this slide that we'll get to in a second, so we can all clap when we get there. The first thing, again, is that 10 gigabit per second line rate that takes you down to about 8.5 when you remove the overhead. Another thing that you can do with NG-PON2 that you can't do with GPON is that you can increase the split up to 1 by 128. And this is going to be important for us to drive down some capital costs. You need an N2 optic to be able to do this, and I'll talk about that towards the end of the presentation. As I said, it uses the same power split network as GPON, and there's the mistake, that's not supposed to be there yet. And as I noted, it can be overlaid on an existing GPON network. The reason for that, of course, is that while you've got the GPON upstream and downstream wavelengths here, and even XGS-PON upstream and downstream, the NG-PON2 wavelengths are different, and so you can have all of these coexisting on a network. But in particular, for Verizon, you could overlay the NG-PON2 onto the GPON. Going back up to this point about the narrower channel bandwidth, the bandwidth for the NG-PON2 is significantly narrower than GPON and even narrower than XGS-PON. And what this means is that you can have a significantly lower timing error for NG-PON2. And that's going to be critical if you've got a service where you need to provide precision time protocol support. So for example, a 5G distribution network might need that in a situation where there's no GPS available. But probably the most important thing that NG-PON2 provides that none of the other access services provide is the support for multiple independent wavelengths. Being able to get independent channels here into the GPON. And you'll see I've shown 4 upstream and downstream channels. That's what's being developed or provided right now by the vendors. The standard actually would support 8, but for now we're using 4. So how does that work into the network? Well, if you go back to this picture, and let's say, for example, that we're overlaid on a GPON network with a single NG-PON2 wavelength, and we're using that to serve some residential customers here. Well, let's say that we've got, in the same area that this PON is covering, a number of cell sites that we'd like to serve, but we certainly don't want to put that cell traffic on the same network or on the same channel as our residential customers. So you just add another wavelength in up here, and now you serve this tower on a different wavelength, and it's completely segmented and independent from your residential traffic. Let's say you've also in that area got a bunch of business customers, small or even enterprise business customers that you want to serve, and you want to segment that traffic as well. Well, you add another wavelength in, and you bring those ONTs up on that third wavelength. Maybe you've got a large enterprise customer here that you'd like to give their own wavelength. You can do that as well. Or maybe you just need to balance the traffic out. You've got a lot of traffic on this wavelength. You can move some of those customers over to this one. And then lastly, what you can do is you can take 2 of those wavelengths and you can bond them together and get not up to 8.5 gigabits worth of traffic. Let's say you had a big enterprise customer who wanted a full 10 gigabit per second channel. You can't do that with a single channel, but if you bond 2 together, you've got a total of 17 that you can get a single 10 gig channel and then a couple of smaller channels as well. So, looking at those advantages, just kind of listing them out, this idea of pay as you grow on a single fiber is really critical. It gives you the opportunity to get started with a relatively smaller capital outlay, and then as more customers or different kinds of customers come, you can grow that network. You can get service separation, as we saw, again, without having to create separate physical PONs and without having to purchase individual OLTs in the office. You can do channel bonding. One of the big opportunities here is maintenance activity. For both planned maintenance activity like an in-service software upgrade or for unplanned maintenance issues, you can do protection and be able to serve your customers and keep that service up even in a situation where it might have gone down with a single wavelength. This item here, the non-service affecting activation, is an interesting one. In order to range an ONT on a PON, you've got quiet windows interspersed in time on that PON, and those 250 microsecond quiet windows can cause jitter problems for some fairly jitter intolerant services. If you can range all of your ONTs on one of the wavelengths, and then once it's ranged, move it over to whatever its home wavelength is going to be, then you can get rid of that quiet window on all of the other wavelengths and use those wavelengths for more jitter intolerant services. So for example, an eCPRI service that you might want to be using to do front haul for 5G. You can do load balancing. As I mentioned earlier, you might have a wavelength that's got a lot of traffic on it. You need to bring a couple of customers up and you want to make sure that they've got good service. You can move some of the larger customers off onto a new wavelength and balance your load out that way. And conversely, if you have a wavelength that doesn't have a lot of traffic on it, you can move the few customers that are on that wavelength off, groom them off, and then you can turn that wavelength down and get some power savings if that's an opportunity for you. And then lastly, rogue mitigation. By being able to move customers around from one wavelength to the next, you open up some very powerful rogue mitigation techniques that allow you both to identify and then isolate a rogue ONU. So that's NG-PON2 and the advantages that we see in it. Let me take a look now at 3 different opportunities that we're really trying to push on the technology side. The first of those is N2 optics that would enable us to get the 1x128 split. The reason that we want to do this, of course, is to lower the cost curve, to increase the number of customers that you can get on a single PON. In doing so, though, what you're going to do is you're going to increase your loss. When you double that split, you've got that 3 dB of loss that you've got to take care of somehow. Well, you can do that in the downstream by first increasing the launch power here. And the vendors have been able to do that. They've gotten about a 2 dB increase in launch power there. The third dB comes from taking this block here and going from a single separate wavelength mux and splitter and integrating them into a single 4x4 element here. So that is the full 3 dB improvement in the downstream. In the upstream, it's a little bit more difficult because getting the upstream sensitivity here increased by 2 dB is difficult. The vendors are working on this now. We're pushing hard to get this done. We're hopeful to be able to get product that we can deploy in the network in 2020. So that's that. Now, recently, you may have seen a press release between Calix and Verizon. We did an awful lot of work and were able to actually bond all 4 NG-PON2 channels and get a single stream of 34 gigabits per second, so 4 times 8.5. We are working now among the vendors and within the standards community to get this productized so that we can have a real capability to provide higher channels than 8.5 gigabits per second to customers who need them. And finally, and this is probably the most aggressive of the 3 technologies and may have the biggest impact long term, is to take an NG-PON2 ONT and reduce it down to a small pluggable form factor. Everything, the optics, which currently now fit in an XFP module. We want to get the optics along with the SoC, the memory, and everything else, an entire ONT, into an SFP plus module, okay? That's a heavy lift, but it's really critical for us because this is what's going to enable us to get service into those integrated RUDU 5G units, because you can't go hanging an ONT and expect to power it next to all these radios everywhere. It's just not tenable. So if you can get an ONT into this form factor and plug it into that radio, then you've got the opportunity to put it on your PON. Not only that, but there's a lot of other equipment that's got SFP plus cages in it, expecting that for its Ethernet input. And so now you can start thinking a lot about different Internet of Things opportunities that come up that can be serviced by a 5G, by an NG-PON2 PON. So we're pushing this development. There are some difficulties that I'm going to talk to you about for a second here. First of all, the basic requirements are when you build this thing, when you plug it into the host, the host's got to think, okay, it's an SFP plus ONT, and it's an SFP plus, and here's my Ethernet. So it's got to look just like a normal Ethernet SFP plus. It's got to be I-temperated because it's going to have to exist. Most of these are outdoors. It's going to need precision timing protocol support because, as I said, there are going to be a number of situations for 5G radios where you may not have access to GPS. The challenges, well, power draw is probably the biggest one. These SFP pluses are designed to draw 1.5 watts. Most cages will provide that support. Some will provide a second rail, so you might have 3 watts. But that's about the extent of it. Trying to get that down into the 3 watt area or less is a real big push. We've got the vendors working on it now. We've also got the radio vendors working with us and the ONT vendors to try to come to a middle ground where we could get a supportable SFP plus ONT. As I said, on the host interface side, it's got to look just like a normal SFP plus, but it's also got to be able to the host has to be able to send a reboot signal to this, and so we'd need to reuse some of the MSA capability and give it that ability. And then from the OLT side, this thing's got to look exactly like an ONT. You've got to be able to activate it, you've got to range it, you've got to be able to configure and provision it, you've got to be able to do maintenance on it, check alarms, and do anything else that you might need to do to a normal ONT. So, as I said, probably the most aggressive thing that we're working on, but we really think this is going to open up an awful lot for us. And so we're pushing hard on it. And we do expect that we're going to have something that we can deploy sometime in the 2020 timeframe. So that's it. I hope I gave you a good view of what we think the advantages of NG-PON2 are, why we're pushing it, and some of the places where we're really trying to push the envelope on the technology side. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Greg.